Hey everyone, first video here. Today we're going to talk about some really cool stuff I ended up doing with an old Sun desktop disk pack and NeXTSTEP for SPARC. So most projects are pretty linear. You got a goal in mind, you start somewhere, and then you just go from there, right? This project was a total weirdo. I had no idea what I was doing. I bought something on eBay, I thought, oh hey, I'll try and fix it up. And I kind of meandered around, bumped into something along the way, gave me a new idea, and I ended up someplace a lot cooler than where I thought I was going to end up. Anyway, let's get started. First thing we'll do is the disk pack setup. So what we're going to do here is, well, basically what I bought on eBay was one of these. It's pretty old, early 90s, that dimpled thing without saying SUN on the front, just the logo there, shows this is in the sort of SPARCstation 1, 2 era. Turning it around, you can see we got a SCSI ID selector on the back, 2 SCSI ports, IEC power connector, on-off switch, and a fan. And this thing is really just designed to hold a hard disk. I don't know why Sun called all these 411s, even though they hold everything from tape drives to CD-ROM drives and everything. I think that's just the enclosure model number. So you got to be really careful with these. The plastic's really brittle, this old ABS plastic. You can see this little hole's a little bit chowdered up, and that's the release for the inside here. So we're going to sort of poke them gently on both sides and pop the top off. And it really takes a lot of coaxing, and you have to be really gentle, otherwise you're just going to snap one of the internal tabs. I'm sure there's probably some secret way of doing it that works every time, but I kind of fiddle my way through it until I basically get it open. You can see on the inside cover here there's these 2 tabs. One of them's broken on this. That's really common in these from my experience. Got some EMF shielding on the inside. Let's get this guy turned around and look at what we've got. So on the front here you just have a power LED, and that's directly connected to the power supply, so it's not an activity LED. The connector's in the back here coming off. There's a tiny circuit board on the back plane of this thing. It's got a standard SCSI 50 pin, a standard Molex power connector, and then connected to this thin tape cable is the SCSI ID selector that can go onto a jumper block on whatever you're plugging into this thing. And there's a metal plate inside. You have to pull that tab down on the bottom, and then the plate will slide out. And yeah, you can see it here. It's got just 4 underside mounting holes for a standard 3.5-inch hard drive. So here's where one of the first problems I ran into in this project. And that really is that the hard drives I have are all old. Some of them are Sun branded, some of them aren't. This is a Sun rebrand of a Fujitsu hard drive, and they all have these SCA connectors. Now these are from later hard drives. These are meant for hot swap. There's no jumpers on these drives, and that 80-pin SCA connector sure isn't going to connect to that thing. So I've got these SCA adapters. They're about $20 on Amazon or eBay, and they can either have a 68-pin high density or a standard 50-pin connector, and they can convert it to this SCSI SCA. Also gives you a standard Molex power connector, and it also gives you the jumper blocks you'll need. So now the issue is that the thickness of that adapter means that the drive has to sit more forward, otherwise it's not going to fit inside this case. So what I'm going to have to do here is I'm going to have to 3D print essentially a bottom plate adapter that's going to move the drive forward by about an inch or a couple centimeters. And so this is just sort of me planning it out. I'm really new to 3D printing, but I've learned that using a pen and some paper and some cheap calipers to really sort of plan it out ahead of time is sort of the way that's working for me so far, as I'm pretty inexperienced. And there I've got an old SCSI to SD adapter that I also did a bottom plate print for. The holes are in different places, but I wanted to sort of see how big it could get. So I just used Tinkercad. No sponsorship here. It's just really simple 3D printing software, and it's free. And I took the SCSI to SD mounting plate that I had made, and I'm just sort of changing the hole positions. And that was really it. This is a really basic design. Slicing it in Cura. I have a really cheap monoprice 3D printer, and here down in the kitchen cabinet to keep everything warm. You can see here the print is done, and now I just gotta get it off the build plate. So it was a really simple design. I'd like to sort of make some things easier about it in the future, but for version 1 design, I like this kind of rapid prototyping I can do, and it works really well. So here's now is me trying to get this thing attached, and I realized that there's some pretty bad design flaws in this, namely that it made it extremely hard to get the nylon screws and nuts into the bottom of this thing. But I eventually, with a bit of finagling, managed to get it all to work. Great, so now we're just reinstalling the metal mounting plate with the disc on it, and we can reconnect the power LED, and then it's just a matter of getting the connectors on the back of the SCA adapter plugged back in. There's the power adapter going in, the SCSI connector, and the SCSI ID selector jumper block connector thingy is a little bit fussy, and it doesn't quite work perfectly. The SCSI ID on the back is not always the same as the SCSI ID it selects, and I think that's just due to the layout of the pins, but it generally works. And you can hear the drive spinning up in the background here, and this is a very noisy drive. All these Fujitsu 3054s are quite noisy, but we can connect it to SPARCstation 1 here just for testing it out, and we're just going to basically check to see if this sees it and what its SCSI ID is. So this is a pretty new PROM in it. The last PROM produced a 2.9, and that PROM has the probe SCSI all command. So if you're in the ROM monitor here, you can just basically type that in. It's going to probe everything on the SCSI bus and report back to you what it sees. And there we go. There's our disk. So project success. It basically works. Now this is just comparing an old Sun Archive 150 tape drive in the same type of enclosure to this external disk pack. And you can see that it's still pretty yellowed, even though it looks pretty good compared to the whiteness of the tape drive underneath it. You can see that it still needs to be retrowrited, but there's really no sunshine where I am right now, so we'll get that retrowrited back in the springtime when the sun comes back out. So now let's go on to part 2. So I've been a pretty big Next fan for a long time, and I haven't saved much paper from my life, but this was from fall of 1990. And these were some copies of Next on Campus, which is a magazine that Next produced for universities. And yeah, I kept all this stuff. Some pretty cool marketing brochures since that time. And anyway, I was on YouTube and watched a guy install NeXTSTEP on his SPARCstation. And I thought, hey, you know what? I got this external disk pack. I can just set that up as an external disk, and I can do that myself. So basically, that's where I went from there. And these old magazines and product brochures that Next had produced were really quite beautiful graphic design for the time. I mean, no surprise with Jobs at the helm, a crazy perfectionist like that. So yeah, anyway, it ended up working out, and I finally got a chance to use NeXTSTEP for the first time in my life. I don't think I've ever used it before. And I was shocked really at how usable and modern it feels. And I mean, no surprise, it ended up becoming Mac OS, which, you know, is a pretty popular and smooth operating system today that I use on a daily basis. So basically the process is pretty straightforward. There's lots of places online you can download NeXTSTEP for RISC. They made a version for PA RISC and SPARC. And it's 3.3 is the sort of initial release of that. And yeah, you can get that. And then the Developer Tools CD, which has all the dev environment for it and libraries you'll need to build apps. And then there's some great software for it. Lighthouse Systems made a whole app suite for it that's they basically gave away for free when Next ended support on it. So let's get started. So here we are. This is my SPARCstation 5, and it's just booting up, and we'll just go over some of the basics here. There's a ton of stuff on the screen. You don't normally see this when a when a SPARCstation boots up. And what all this is the extended diagnostics. You can see it says the ID PROM contents are invalid. So it's got a bad ID PROM battery in it that I need to dig into and solder a new battery on, which is no problem. We'll do that in another video. But what you can see here is it's starting up. It's got 256 megs of RAM in it. You can see going through all the memory banks. You can see it's got the Fujitsu. This is a micro SPARC 2 processor at 110 megahertz. And you can see everything in the S bus. You can see all its built-in stuff, the SCSI adapter, the Ethernet adapter. You can see next it's got its sound chip, the CS4231. It's got a 4 OC3 ATM adapter in it. I'm not going to use that here. It's not compatible with NeXTSTEP. Yeah, it's got this really nice 24-bit, very rare color adapter for the SPARCstation 5 in it. It's not fast, but it's pretty. And yeah, you can see it comes up. It doesn't know a host ID. It doesn't have an Ethernet address. So really the first thing we want to do is we want to set the defaults, clear the defaults. And then what we're going to do is we're going to turn off all these extended diagnostics because it takes about a minute to 2 minutes to boot up if they're turned on. It outputs a ton of stuff to the serial port during that period. So we're going to change it from true to false. And then what we're going to do here, I'm just going to quickly go through it and just going to reprogram the PROM to basically give it an Ethernet address and host ID, calculate the checksum, and then we're good to go. You can see boot is quite fast this time, doesn't have a lot on it. It comes up and says, I don't know what to boot on. I'm trying to boot from disk SCSI ID 3. There are 2 drives and disks in this, rather, 3 and 0, but we're just going to boot it off the CD-ROM. I've got my external disconnected and it's SCSI ID 2. So you can see here it's booted from SCSI ID 6. NeXTSTEP comes up, sees all the RAM in it, and it gives us a couple options. We can do an extended boot. If we type -V, we'll see sort of all the boot diagnostics, but I'm just going to do this as standard as possible in case anyone's following along here. So it boots up, gives us some language options. Sadly, I don't speak any language other than English well enough to know how to install an operating system in it, so we'll just use that. Great. It comes up and really says it's going to delete everything on the hard disk here, so be careful. And I don't want to delete anything off the drives that are inside the SPARCstation. I just want to install this onto the external drive, so we can still go ahead. On the next screen it's going to give us some options to decide where we actually want to install this. So it's not super fast. It's reading everything off the CD-ROM, and this is not a fast CD-ROM drive. It's single or double, maybe at most quad speed. But you can see it coming up here, and it's enumerating all the hardware, finding everything, and it's actually pretty fast for being able to do all this off the CD-ROM drives. And you can see it's finding the 3 disks installed. The 2 internals are a Seagate. They're Sun rebranded Seagate drives, and our external is a Sun rebranded Fujitsu drive. They're all called Sun 4.2 gig drives. It sees the CD-ROM, boots up, no problem. And NeXTSTEP 3.3, at least the original version of it, is not Y2K compliant, so it'll always complain about the clock. But anyway, here it's asking me what SCSI ID we want to install it to, and it's by default trying to install it to what it considers to be target 1. Which is SCSI ID 3 or 0, I'm not sure which one here. And we're going to use advanced installation options here, and it's going to list all the drives, and we're just going to tell it no, we're going to use target 2. We know that this is the disk that we want to install it to. Great. And then after that, we're pretty much off to the races. It's going to go through a text installer here now, and we'll just fast forward through a bunch of this. This took about 20 minutes or so, and the autofocus on the camera is going a little wonky, but it worked out okay. And then we'll reboot, and what we can do at that point is, just to make our life easier, we're just going to set the default boot device, because it's coming up here, and again it's looking for SCSI ID 3 to boot off of. We're just going to set this environment variable of boot device to disk 2, which is SCSI ID 2, and yeah, we can reboot, and this is what happens next. So NeXTSTEP boots up, it complains it can't find a network configuration, so you can just hit Control-C. And it comes up into this graphical installer, and you can see I've got this weird sort of ghosting of the mouse pointer. I don't know if that's something to do with the S24 graphics card I've got, if it's a hardware failure or whether it's a bug in the Next software. But anyway, it still works okay, and it's pretty bearable actually, even when using the OS. But you can see it's come up, it's detected over my graphics card, the mouse, the network adapter, SCSI, audio, pretty much everything. It looks like it's all working here. So we're just going to save that, and it's going to continue booting, and then it goes into this screen here where we've got a couple options. We can choose which languages to install, and then there's just some optional components, but they really don't take up that much space. So again, we'll just use English as the default language, and we'll leave everything else. Documentation, Digital Webster's Dictionary. Sure, let's just install it all. It says it's going to take about 500 megs, and that's fine. This is a 4.2 gig drive. And we'll just click install, and pretty much that's it. This takes about another 20 minutes in this setup that I'm using to do the install. So it's not too fast. Just walk away. It kind of finishes after 62%. I don't know what that's all about, but anyway, works out okay. And we'll just click restart to reboot the computer and hopefully see the OS for the first time here. So this is what happens on first boot. It really just comes up and dies and gives us a couple options here. I don't know BSD at all to really get things going, so I'd like to see the diagnostics on boot here. So I'm just going to reboot, and I'm going to use that -V flag on boot here to be able to actually see what it's trying to tell me, or maybe give me a hint as to what's going wrong. And so we see it coming up. And so far so good. No errors, just enumerating all the hardware. Coming up, resetting the SCSI bus. And then we should be able to see the disks. See, SCSI ID SD0 here. It's one of the Seagate drives. Here's a Fujitsu drive. It's SD1. SD2 is the other Seagate drive that we're not using. We can see here it's trying to look at the label on our SD0, and we don't want to boot off that disk. I don't know why it's trying to check it or look at it, but it's got a Solaris disk label on it, so it's not going to be able to read it. So this looks like the problem. And for some reason, it's trying to boot off this. So let's take a look at the FSTAP file here, and we can see here it's only really trying to mount one disk as the root partition, and it's the wrong disk. So I assume this is just sort of a bug in the NeXTSTEP installer, where even though we told it, hey, use this other disk, it's coming up by default with sort of the lowest numbered SCSI device to try to boot from. So we got to fix this. But one of the issues right now is this file system is mounted as read-only. So in order to edit this file, we're just going to have to remount it as a read-write permissions. And yeah, we're pretty good there. Okay. Now it's got VI on it, but it's ancient VI, so it's cranky, and I'm no VI wizard, so it's going to come up here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete the whole file and insert a new line and sort of retype that out, but using the correct disk number here, SD1A, to boot from. Same options. I don't want to change anything here. Great. And we'll just write this file and reboot, and we should be good to go. So let's see what happens here if we get any more luck. So we see it coming up, and we'll just let it do its thing here. And so far so good. So you can see again it comes up, and you got to hit Control-C to end the network configuration. It tells you what to do there, just because it says I can't find a network config. But this is NeXTSTEP. This is the initial boot. Asks us what language we want. You can see the OS starting to come up here. It finds the Solaris disks installed, and of course it can't read them. So we're just going to click Ignore for that. And there's the second disk. We're logged in now as the me user. And it creates two users. It creates a me user and a root user, and neither of them have a password installed. So we should probably fix that before sort of going on to anything else, because we're going to want to also configure the network, really importantly. So what we can do is if you click on the computer, you can see there's these the NeXTAdmin folder, and we can start up the user manager, and again it's going to want us to authenticate as the root user. There is no password, so just basically hit enter. And then sure, we can go in and I won't go through this in too much detail. This is pretty straightforward stuff, but I'm just basically going to give the me user a password, and this is really just kind of good housekeeping kind of stuff to do. So now I've logged out. I'm going to log in as the root user, just to sort of show you it's got a bit of a different look to it as the root user. A few more apps down in the panel on the right hand side. And we're going to go into this simple network starter app where we can configure the network. Now Next networks are a little bit complex. They have something called a net info server, and we're not part of a larger Next network here, so we're going to basically tell this computer that it's its own net info server. This is really just standard network configuration. We're going to give it a host name, give it an IP address, tell it who its router is, that kind of stuff. So we can do that here in the network options. We do have to tell it it's not running I'm not running any kind of router discovery protocol or something like that. And so we'll just give it a default route, and we probably don't need to configure the broadcast. That's just old habits. And in terms of the step 3 here, you just need the first one checked off. I'm going to play around with SNMP later, see what a next looks like to the rest of the world on SNMP, but that's really it. You can just click configure, and you're going to be almost up and running here. There's one more step we're going to have to do. So great, I'll quit that. And then really the next thing I want to do is go into a terminal screen, and DNS isn't set up. You didn't notice there was no option there, but we can go into run ifconfig-a. We'll look at all our interfaces. We can see it's got the IP we assigned it, and we'll just check to see if we can ping our router, and we can. So we've got network connectivity at this point. We can look at our routing table, and again we see the default route points to the right router. So technically speaking, at this point we've got everything we need to be able to ping out to the internet. So we can hit Google's DNS server. That's great. So we've got a SPARCstation 5 running next, connected to the internet here, thankfully behind a firewall. But if we want DNS working, we need to create a resolve.conf file in the etc directory. And a really simple file, just needs one line. You can have more than one, but you just want to give it a name server. And we're going to point it to that Google DNS server at 8.8.8.8. And that's pretty much it. We're kind of off to the races at this point. You do need to reboot in order for the DNS configurations to take effect. But that's it. Once this comes back up, we can ping google.com, and there aren't going to be really any issues. So that's it. Thanks everyone for joining. It's been a real pleasure to put this together. It's been fun. Got to use some stuff from eBay, use an old disk. I got to do some 3D printing, which was kind of a blast. I got to install NeXTSTEP, an OS I've never used before, and I was blown away. It was a real blast. So that's it for now. Thanks everyone for joining. I hope everyone stays safe, and hopefully we'll be able to make some more of these in the future. And have a great day.